There's a moment, and every guard who's served long enough knows it, where something shifts. Not dramatically, not with alarms or shouting or the kind of chaos they train you for in the first weeks of service. It's quieter than that. Subtler. It's the moment where the air in a room changes and something in your gut tells you that whatever happens next is going to matter for a very long time. I felt that moment twice in my career. The first time was during the border summit of year 12, when an envoy from the eastern provinces brought a sealed letter that nobody at the table wanted to open. I was posted at the door that day, standing still as furniture, watching faces go pale under candlelight. The second time was the night I found the Queen's phone. And I'm still not sure which one changed me more. My name is Dorian Ashvane. I served 14 years in the Royal Household Guard of Veldoria, specifically under the Palace Interior Division, which sounds grander than it is. We weren't the ones standing at the gates with ceremonial rifles and polished boots for public processions. We were the ones inside, the ones who saw what happened after the doors closed and the banners were folded away. We saw the arguments between aides. We saw the king eat dinner alone in a dining room built for 40. We saw the Queen's secretary cry in a back corridor and then compose herself in under 60 seconds and walk back into a meeting like nothing had happened. We saw things, and the first rule of the Interior Division, the one they hammer into you before anything else, before protocol, before emergency procedures, before even how to properly address a senior member of the royal family, is this. What happens inside these walls stays inside these walls. I believed in that rule for 14 years. I still believe in parts of it. But there are things you carry that become too heavy to keep carrying alone. And I've reached that age now, that particular quietness on the other side of service, where I think certain truths belong to the record, even if they make people uncomfortable. So I'm going to tell you what happened. All of it. The palace at Veldoria's capital, Havenmore, sits on a ridge above the old city like something that grew there rather than was built. It's gray stone, mostly, the kind that looks silver in morning light and almost black when it rains. The grounds run for about 40 acres inside the outer wall, and in autumn, which is when this story takes place, the trees along the east walk turn a color that I can only describe as burning. It was a Thursday in late autumn. I know that because Thursdays were always mine. My assigned interior rotation brought me to the Queen's wing on Thursdays and Sundays, and on Thursdays the night shift started at 9 and ran through to 5 in the morning. Nobody particularly wants the Thursday overnight. The hours are odd, the wing is quiet, and there's a particular kind of loneliness to walking those corridors at 2 in the morning when the rest of the palace is asleep, and the only sounds are the old building settling into itself. But I'd had the Thursday rotation for 3 years by then, and I'd made a kind of peace with it. You learn to appreciate the silence. You learn to notice things in it. The Queen's wing was on the north side of the palace, 2 floors above the main formal receiving rooms. It was a suite of about 15 interconnected rooms. The bedroom itself, a sitting room, a private study, a dressing room, a small library, and several connecting corridors and antechambers that led either back toward the main palace or out through a secondary staircase to the gardens. Queen Isolde had occupied these rooms for 9 years. She'd come to Veldoria from the Kingdom of Caldris as a diplomatic bride. That's the polite way to say it. And in the early years, by all accounts, it hadn't been easy. The court had been formal to the point of coldness with her. The king, Edvard III, was not an unkind man, but he was a distant one, shaped by a father who'd believed warmth was a weakness in a ruler. By the time I joined the Interior Division, though, Queen Isolde had found her footing. She was respected, genuinely, not just formally. She had a way with people that cut through ceremony without disrespecting it. She remembered names. She asked questions that showed she'd been listening to the last thing you said, sometimes weeks earlier. She was the kind of person who made you feel, even in a 5-second corridor exchange, that you mattered to her. I liked her, most of us did. Which is what made what I found so difficult to sit with. The evening started normally. I relieved the day shift guard at 9, a man named Tarek who'd been in the division almost as long as me. He gave me the handover notes. The Queen had returned from a state dinner at 7:30, had met briefly with her private secretary at 8, and had retired to her sitting room at 8:45. No unusual activity, no additional visitors expected, standard overnight. Tarek left. I took my position in the antechamber at the east end of the Queen's wing and settled in. For the first hour, nothing moved. The corridor light was on its evening setting, dimmed to about a third, warm and amber rather than the bright white it ran at during the day. The carpeting absorbed my footsteps. The only sounds were the distant tick of the long-case clock at the far end of the wing, the occasional creak of the building, and once, around 10, the muffled sound of what I thought was the Queen moving through her sitting room. I did my standard walk at 10:30. One slow loop of the permitted perimeter. I did not enter the private rooms unless there was a reason to, but I walked the outer corridor, checked the service door, checked the secondary staircase, walked back. Everything normal. At 11, I walked it again. Everything still normal. It was just after midnight when the sitting room door opened. Queen Isolde came out in a dressing gown, dark blue, thick velvet, the kind that suggested she'd been prepared for bed but hadn't managed to sleep. She was holding a glass of water, and she looked, I noticed, tired in a way that went beyond the hour. She saw me and didn't seem startled, which told me she'd known I was on duty. She always knew the rotation. "Ashvin," she said. "Your Majesty," I gave the required incline of the head. She stood there for a moment, in the amber light of the corridor, looking at something past me that wasn't really there. I'd seen that look before, not on her specifically, but on people who were carrying something heavy and had momentarily forgotten to hide it. "Is the East Garden lit tonight?" she asked. "I believe so, ma'am. The perimeter lights run all night." She nodded slowly. "Good," she said, though she didn't seem to be responding to what I'd said exactly, and then she went back into the sitting room and closed the door softly. I stood there for a moment. Then I continued my rotation. It was 1:30 in the morning when it happened. I was on my second walk of the North Corridor, past the library around the corner toward the service alcove, when I saw it. It was sitting on the window ledge at the far end of the corridor, just sitting there, glowing faintly in the dark. A phone, a small, dark-cased phone, screen dimly lit with what looked like an incoming notification, balanced on the stone ledge beside the window. I stopped. Now I want to be precise about what I was thinking in that moment, because it matters. My first thought was not what's on it. My first thought was whose is it, and then immediately after, how did it get here? That corridor, the North Corridor of the Queen's wing, was not a through route for staff. It didn't connect to anything that regular household staff would have reason to use after 9 in the evening. The only people who had access to it overnight were the Interior Division guard on duty, meaning me, and the Queen herself. The Queen's secretary had left at 8. Tarek had handed over at 9. No one else had come through that wing since I'd taken the shift. And yet there was a phone sitting on a window ledge that had not been there at 10:30 when I'd walked this same path. I walked toward it slowly. It was a personal device, not the official encrypted phone that members of the royal family carried for state communications, which was a larger, heavier handset in a pale gray case. This was a slim, dark-cased phone, the kind that was commercially available, with no insignia and no lanyard. There was a name on the screen. The notification had come in while the screen was still dimly active, and the preview was visible. The name said, R. Just that, a single letter. And beneath it, in the preview text before it cut off, did she find out about the message cut there? I stood in that corridor for what felt like a long time, but was probably about 40 seconds. And in those 40 seconds, I had the single most complicated internal argument of my career. Because here is what the protocol said, clearly and without ambiguity. If you find an unattended personal device in a restricted area of the palace, you log it, you secure it, and you report it to your shift supervisor at the end of rotation. You do not access it. You do not read it. You do not look at it beyond what is necessary to identify it for logging purposes. That's the protocol. And here is what the other part of my brain was doing. Turning over the words, did she find out about and asking what came after. I picked up the phone. I want to be honest about that. I picked it up and I looked at the screen and I thought about what I was doing, and I did it anyway, because 14 years of watching things and saying nothing had built up in me a particular kind of pressure. And that night, for some reason I still don't fully understand, something gave. The screen was still partially active, not locked, which told me it had been unlocked recently, within the last few minutes. The conversation thread from R was visible in the notification panel. I tapped it. The thread opened, and what I read in the next 4 minutes changed the way I understood the previous 3 years of my life inside that palace. The conversation between the Queen, and I knew it was the Queen's phone by then, because the contact listed at the top of the thread on the other side was saved under the name Rosalind, which I knew was the name of Queen Isolde's youngest sister, who lived in Caldris and visited twice a year, went back approximately 6 weeks. I'm not going to reproduce every word. That's not what this is about. But the shape of it, the thing it revealed, was this. The Queen had been communicating with her sister about something that the palace's official communications would never have carried. Something that, if the King's senior council had seen it, would have caused a crisis that would have made the border summit of year 12 look like a minor inconvenience. She was planning to leave. Not publicly, not formally, not with a dissolution of the marriage or any of the official mechanisms that the royal house protocols provided for. She was planning to leave quietly, in the way that people who have run out of other options sometimes leave, with a bag and a trusted contact and a route that nobody else knows about. And her sister, R, was helping her. The message that had come in tonight, the one whose preview I'd seen on the locked screen, read in full. Rosalind, did she find out about the travel documents? The courier was supposed to be careful. I put the phone down on the ledge. I stood there in the amber corridor light with my hands very still at my sides, and I breathed. And I thought about 14 years. I thought about the first rule of the Interior Division. I thought about the King, eating dinner alone in a dining room built for 40. I thought about Queen Isolde in the corridor an hour ago, looking at something past me that wasn't there, asking whether the East Garden was lit. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand that the phone had not been left on that window ledge by accident. There's something they don't prepare you for in training. They prepare you for a lot of things: physical threats, protocol breaches, how to move in formation around a principal in a crowd, how to be invisible in a room and still be watching every corner of it, how to write an incident report in language that is precise but doesn't inflame. They don't prepare you for the moment you realize you're not just a guard, you're a witness. And the thing you're witnessing is a human being's private desperation. I stood in that corridor for 3 full minutes before I moved. The clock at the end of the wing counted it off. I know because I was listening to it, one of those old mechanisms that ticks at about 50 beats a minute, slower than a resting heartbeat, which means it has a particular effect on you if you're standing still long enough to hear it. It slows something down inside you, or maybe it just makes you aware of how fast everything else is moving. I picked the phone up again. Not to read more, I'd seen enough, more than enough, but because leaving it there now felt wrong. It had been placed there deliberately, I was almost certain of that, but whoever had placed it needed to know that it had been found by the wrong person or the right person, depending on how you looked at it. I held it for a moment. Then I walked back down the corridor to the antechamber, sat down in the hard wooden chair that had been my companion through 1,000 overnight shifts, and tried to think clearly. Let me tell you what I knew. The phone belonged to Queen Isolde. That wasn't a guess within the conversation thread I'd seen. There were references that made it unmistakable. Names of palace staff, references to rooms. One message from Rosalind that said, explicitly, the east staircase, because that's the one the overnight guard doesn't cover on Sundays, which told me, among other things, that someone had studied my rotation schedule. That last detail sat with me uncomfortably. The messages spanned 6 weeks. In that time, Queen Isolde and her sister had discussed a route, not detailed but suggested. Documents. A contact in the port city of Aranmere, which was Veldoria's main maritime city and the most logical departure point if you wanted to leave the kingdom quietly. A timeline that was, by my reading of the most recent messages, not distant. Weeks, not months. And the most recent message, the one that had come in tonight, the one I'd seen in preview, asked whether the Queen had been discovered. Which meant someone, somewhere, was worried the plan had been compromised. Which meant the phone being left in that corridor might have been the Queen's way of communicating something, or might have been something else entirely. I turned it over in my hands. And then I heard the sitting room door open again. Footsteps in the corridor. Not the Queen's. I knew her walk after 3 years of overnight shifts, knew the particular rhythm of it, the slight pause on the left foot that came from an old injury she'd mentioned once to her secretary. These footsteps were lighter, quicker. I was on my feet before I'd consciously decided to stand. I moved to the doorway of the antechamber and looked down the corridor. A figure was moving fast through the amber light toward the window ledge. It was a woman, young, mid-20s, I would guess. Dark coat, the kind that servants wore in the outer household, though at this hour there should have been no outer household staff in this wing. She was moving with the focused speed of someone who knows exactly where they're going and why. She reached the window ledge. She stopped. She looked at the ledge. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned and saw me. The thing about being trained to be invisible in a room is that it works both ways. When someone suddenly becomes visible to you after you've been watching them without them knowing, the effect on them is significant. She went very still. I walked toward her at a measured pace, not rushing, not aggressive. Just steady and direct, the way they train you to move in uncertain situations. "Good evening," I said. She said nothing. "Can I ask what you're doing in this wing?" I said. I kept my voice level. She was young, I could see that better now. She had the look of someone who had been running on adrenaline for a while and was suddenly, abruptly out of it. Her eyes went to my hands. She saw the phone, and whatever composure she'd been holding onto visibly fractured. "Please," she said, "don't." "Don't what?" I said, though I understood what she meant. She swallowed. "Please just put it back," she said. "I was supposed to retrieve it before anyone." "Before anyone found it," I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were very dark and very frightened, and there was something else in them, something that took me a moment to identify. Loyalty. That was what I was seeing, not guilt, not scheming. She was frightened the way someone is frightened when they've done something risky for someone else and the risk hasn't paid off. "Who are you?" I asked. She hesitated, then, "Myra, I'm Her Majesty's. I serve in the private household, personal staff." "How long?" "4 years." I looked at her. She was telling the truth. I'd seen her before, in the way you see familiar faces in a place you spend a lot of time without necessarily learning their names. She was one of the Queen's personal attendants, one of the small inner circle who actually had routine access to the private rooms. "Did the Queen ask you to retrieve this?" I said. She hesitated again. "Myra," I said quietly, "did the Queen ask you to retrieve this?" She looked at the floor, then she nodded once, very small. I made a decision in that moment. It wasn't a decision I'd been trained to make. It wasn't in any protocol manual. It wasn't the kind of thing I could have written into an incident report and had it make sense to anyone reading it. But I made it. I held the phone out to her. She looked at it, then at me. "Take it," I said. She took it slowly, as if she expected me to change my mind. "Return it to Her Majesty," I said, "and tell her that the North Corridor is covered on Thursday nights." She frowned, not understanding. "She'll understand," I said. "Tell her exactly that." Myra looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression. The fear didn't leave, but something else moved alongside it. Something that might have been gratitude or might have been the beginning of trust. She left the corridor quickly, back the way she'd come. I stood there alone in the amber light. The clock ticked. I went back to my chair and sat down and spent the next 3 hours trying to figure out what I had just done and whether I could live with it. The rest of that shift passed without incident. At 5 in the morning, the relief guard arrived. A young man named Callum, newer to the division, who had the slightly too-awake energy of someone who'd had too much coffee to compensate for the early hour. He gave me the standard greeting. I gave him the standard handover. "Nothing unusual," I said. "Quiet night." I said it smoothly, easily, the way you say things when you've been carrying secrets in that building long enough that the words come naturally. I walked down through the palace, those long early morning corridors with the gray light just beginning at the windows, and out through the staff entrance on the south side, And I sat on a stone bench in the outer courtyard and looked at the sky lightening over Havenmore and thought about what I'd read on that phone. She was planning to leave. I turned that over and over. Not because I was judging it. I wasn't. I had neither the full picture nor the right to judge the private decisions of a woman whose life I only glimpsed from corridor length. But because the reality of it, the sheer human weight of it, was pressing on me in a way I hadn't expected. 9 years she'd been in that palace. She'd come as a diplomatic bride from Caldris, a kingdom that shared a border with Veldoria but spoke a different first language and observed different customs, and had a royal court with a completely different culture. She'd been expected to adapt, to become Veldorian, to fold herself into a marriage and an institution that hadn't been built with her comfort in mind. And for 9 years she'd done that, publicly, gracefully, with the kind of composure that made it look effortless when it was anything but. And quietly, in the dark, in messages to her sister with a single initial for a contact name, she'd been building a different plan. I understood that, maybe more than I was supposed to. I went home. I slept badly, the way you sleep when your mind keeps returning to a particular image. In my case, it was the word Rosalind on a phone screen, and below it, did she find out about the travel documents? When I woke up, it was afternoon, and I lay in the low autumn light in my apartment and thought about what I was going to do next. Because here's the thing about what I decided in that corridor, handing the phone back, telling Myra to carry a message to the Queen. It wasn't a conclusion. It was a beginning, because now I knew something, and the Queen knew that I knew, and one of us was going to have to address that eventually. I didn't know how. Not yet. The next Thursday came. I took my position at 9. The handover from Tarek was routine. I walked the first perimeter at 10:30, nothing unusual. But at 11:45, the sitting room door opened, and Queen Isolde came out into the corridor. Same dressing gown, same glass of water, though I wasn't sure she'd actually drunk any of it. She walked to the window at the end of the corridor, the window where the phone had been sitting a week ago, and stood looking out at the east garden below. I watched her from my position. After a moment she said, without turning, "Myra gave me your message." "I thought she would, ma'am." A pause. "The North Corridor," she said, "on Thursdays." "Yes, ma'am." She turned then and looked at me directly, and in her face I saw the thing I'd seen in Myra's face in the moment I'd handed over the phone, the beginning of a calculation, the weighing of something. "Why did you give it back?" she said. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because finding something that doesn't belong to you doesn't mean you have a right to decide what happens with it, I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "That's not quite the answer I expected," she said. "No, ma'am. Most men in your position would have." She stopped, started again. "There are people in this palace who would have had that phone in the hands of the King's Council within the hour." "I know," I said. "And you didn't." "No." She looked at me. That amber light was on her again, the evening setting, that particular warmth that made everything in that corridor feel slightly suspended from the normal rules of time. "Can I ask you something, Ashvin?" "Of course, ma'am." "How long have you been on the Thursday rotation?" 3 years, I said. She nodded slowly. 3 years, she said, as if that answered something for her. Then, and in 3 years, have you ever reported anything that happened in this wing to anyone outside the division's standard incident log? "No, ma'am." "Not once." "Not once." She held my gaze, and I held hers. And in that silence, something was understood between us that neither of us could have put cleanly into words, a kind of recognition, of one person who had learned to be invisible to another person who had also learned to be invisible, and the strange, particular solidarity of that. "Good night, Ashvin," she said. "Good night, ma'am." She went back into the sitting room. I went back to my chair, and I sat with the weight of what I now carried, and thought about what it meant to serve, and whether the oath I'd taken at the start of my career and the decision I'd made in that corridor were the same thing or opposite things, and I still haven't fully resolved that question. But I know what I did, and I know why. There's a particular skill that people in long service develop, and it doesn't have an official name. The closest I can get to it is managing what you know. It's not the same as lying. It's not even really the same as omission, though it involves a lot of that. It's more like knowing which truths live in which compartments of yourself and keeping those compartments from touching in ways that cause damage. Every person who has served in a sensitive position for long enough develops this skill. The doctors who know things about their patients that the patients' families don't. The lawyers who carry the full weight of what their clients have done. The household staff in a place like Havenmore Palace who hear and see and understand things that the official record will never contain. I had practiced this skill for 14 years. After that Thursday conversation with Queen Isolde, I had to practice it harder than I ever had before. The weeks that followed were strange. Not dramatically so, nothing in the palace changed as far as the visible surface of it was concerned. The autumn deepened. The leaves on the east walk finished burning and began to fall. The court calendar moved through its scheduled events. A diplomatic reception, a state visit from the Kingdom of Renholt, a series of charitable engagements that the Queen attended with her usual grace and composure. I watched her at those events, from my assigned positions in the Interior Division rotation. I watched the way she spoke to dignitaries, the way she moved through a receiving line with the practiced ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times, the way she listened when the king addressed the room, attentive and expressionless. Nobody in that room would have known. That's what it looked like from the outside, seamless, complete, a royal household operating exactly as it was supposed to. And underneath it, something else entirely. I didn't see her alone again until the third Thursday of November. The shift had been uneventful in the way all my shifts were uneventful on the surface. Walking, listening, watching, logging. At around 2 in the morning, I was passing the library door when I heard a sound from inside that stopped me. Not a crisis sound, not the kind of sound that activates the emergency response sequence they drill into you, just crying. Quiet, controlled crying, the kind that someone does when they're trying very hard not to be heard. I stood outside the library door. This is one of those moments that the protocol manual doesn't cover. The manual assumes that a guard's function is to protect the principal from external threats, intruders, physical danger, the various hazards that come from being a high-profile figure in a complicated world. It doesn't address what you do when the threat to the principal isn't external. When the threat is the life itself. I knocked softly on the library door, 3 quiet knocks. The crying stopped. A long pause. Ashvin, her voice. Yes, ma'am. Another pause. Then come in. The library in the Queen's Wing was a small room, maybe 20 feet by 15, lined floor to ceiling on 3 walls with books that were actually read. You could tell because they weren't perfectly arranged. Some of them were angled slightly where they'd been pulled out and replaced at a hurry. Some had bookmarks in them. One had a folded piece of paper tucked in the cover that might have been a letter. A reading lamp was on in the corner, casting a pool of yellow light. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax polish, and something floral faintly that I couldn't identify. Queen Isolde was sitting in the chair nearest the lamp. She had a book open on her lap, but clearly hadn't been reading it. Her eyes were dry now, but there was a visible effort in that. She was sitting very straight, the kind of posture you maintain when relaxing it would mean something giving way. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me. I'm sorry, she said. She stopped. I don't usually. You don't need to apologize, ma'am. She looked at me. Her gaze had a directness to it that I'd noticed before, the particular quality of someone who has been forced, by circumstance, to become an excellent reader of people, and who now finds it difficult to look at anyone without doing it unconsciously. Sit down, she said. I hesitated. This was also not in the manual. Please, she said. I can only have this conversation if you're not standing at the door like you're about to repel an invasion. I sat down, in the chair on the other side of the reading lamp. And for a moment we just sat there, 2 people in a small room in the middle of the night, surrounded by books and the palace ticking quietly around us. How much did you read? She said. Enough to understand the shape of it, I said. Not everything. The shape of it, she repeated. That's a careful way to put it. I try to be careful. A faint, wry movement at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. You're very careful, Ashvin. I've noticed that about you. 3 years of Thursday nights and you've never, she paused. You've always been very contained." "It seemed right," I said. "Most people find it easier to be contained when they don't have anything to contain," she said. "You seem to have quite a lot of it and still manage." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I said nothing. She looked at the book on her lap, then she closed it and set it aside. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "And I'm going to ask you to answer me honestly, not as a guard, not as someone who has protocols to follow and oaths that cover certain things, just as a person." "I'll try, ma'am." "Do you think I'm wrong?" she said. "What you read, the shape of it, as you said, do you think I'm wrong to want it?" I sat with that question for a moment, because it deserved a real answer, and real answers to complicated questions take a moment to find. "No," I said finally, "I don't think you're wrong to want it." She looked at me. "But," I said. "There's a but." "There usually is." She waited. "There are people," I said carefully, "who would be hurt by the way it happens if it happens the way it's currently planned. Not the king, or not only the king. People whose positions depend on the stability of this household. People who have no part in whatever has brought you to this." She was very still. "I'm not saying that changes your right to it," I said. "I'm saying the shape of how it happens matters, not just for you, for everyone attached to this place." She looked at her hands in her lap. "You sound like my sister," she said quietly. "She sounds sensible," I said. Another almost smile, fleeting. "She is," she said. "She's been trying to slow me down, to make me think about what happens after the first 3 moves, not just the first one." She paused. "I haven't been very good at listening." "That's understandable," I said. "Is it?" "When someone's been holding something in for a long time," I said, "the release of it tends not to be calm. It tends to be fast. People plan exits like they're running from something rather than running towards something." She looked at me, that direct gaze again, reading me. "Which were you doing," she said, "when you left?" I felt that question land. "What makes you think I left something?" I said. 14 years in this building," she said. "At your level of you're not here because you had nowhere else to go, Ashvin. You're here because at some point this kind of invisible, contained, watchful existence made sense to you. Which usually means the outside of it had stopped making sense." I sat with that. She was right. I wasn't going to confirm it. That was further down the road of intimacy than even this strange 2 in the morning library conversation warranted. But she was right. "I was running from," I said eventually. "I think, at the time, it took a while to turn it into running toward." She nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something. "I'm still at the first part," she said. "I know," I said. We sat in silence for a while after that. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people have said more than they expected to and need a moment to let the room settle. Outside, the palace was very quiet. The autumn wind had picked up, and I could hear it at the library's single high window, a narrow rectangle of black sky, and the very faint orange of the city below. Eventually, she said, "What are you going to do?" "With what I know." Yes. I had thought about this. For weeks, in the insomniac hours of my off days, I had thought about this. Turned it over from every angle. Looked at it in the protocol manual's terms, in the oath's terms, in the simple human terms. "Nothing," I said. She frowned. "Nothing." "I found a phone that wasn't mine," I said. "I returned it, end of incident." "It isn't that simple." "It is," I said, "if I decide it is." She looked at me for a long time. "You know what happens," she said carefully, "if someone else finds something. If there's a leak somewhere I haven't accounted for. If one of the contacts, if anything surfaces. Then that's something else," I said. "That's not something you found in my rotation. And if they trace something back to this wing, to a Thursday night. Then I logged a quiet shift," I said, "as I always do." She was very still. "Why?" she said, and her voice had changed, not the controlled, precise voice of a queen managing a difficult conversation, something more unguarded. "Why would you do that? You don't know me, not really." I thought about the corridor, a month ago, the way she'd stood in the amber light looking at something past me that wasn't there. The way she'd asked if the East Garden was lit, and the way I'd known, even then, that the question was something other than a question. I know what I've seen, I said. Over 3 years, and what I've seen is someone trying very hard to do the right thing in a situation that doesn't have a right thing. She looked at the window for a moment, the black rectangle of sky. There's a version of me, she said softly, that wishes I'd been braver earlier, before the shape of things became what they are. Maybe, I said, but that version didn't have the 3 years of information this version has. She looked back at me. You really are a very unusual man, Ashvin, she said. So I've been told, ma'am. This time the smile reached her eyes. She left Veldoria in the 3rd week of January. I know that because I've kept track from the outside, from the small pieces of information that filter through to people who used to work in places like Havenmore Palace. It was managed, not perfectly, but better than the rushed early plan I'd glimpsed in those messages. The timeline had been extended. Things had been put in order. There was an official announcement, formal language, mutual agreement. The phrases that royal households use when they want to describe something complicated in the simplest possible terms. The King's Court managed it as quietly as any royal separation can be managed, which means there were rumors for months and official confirmation only when everything was already in place. Havenmore, from what I understand, continued to function. These places always do. That's both the remarkable thing about institutions like that and the tragedy of them. They continue regardless. The individuals inside them change and suffer and make impossible decisions and sometimes find ways out, and the building keeps standing. I left the Interior Division 6 months after she did. Not because of anything connected to her departure, not directly. My contract was up for renewal, and I looked at the number, 14 years, and thought about what I'd said in that library about running from versus running toward. And I decided I'd been invisible long enough. I took a position with a private security firm in the capital. Legitimate work, considerably less complicated. Good people. I think about that night sometimes. The amber corridor, the phone glowing on the window ledge, the word Rosalind on a screen. I think about what it means to find something that doesn't belong to you and have to decide what to do with it. Not just a phone, a truth, a situation, a piece of someone else's life. There's no protocol for that. There's no manual that tells you the right answer. You just have to decide what kind of person you want to be when the moment comes. And then you have to live with it. I've lived with mine. I think I made the right call. But I'll tell you something honestly. The part that stays with me isn't the decision in the corridor, or the conversation in the library, or even the content of those messages. The part that stays with me is the look on her face in that library window light, when she said I'm still at the first part. The running from part. I've seen that look on a lot of faces in my life. And what I know, what 14 years of watching people in contained spaces taught me, is that the people who carry it the longest are the ones who have the furthest to go before they find the other side of it. I hope she made it to the other side. I think she did. But some things you never quite know for certain, and perhaps that's right too. Some things are meant to stay in that amber corridor, in the middle of the night, between the clock ticking at 50 beats a minute and the East Garden burning quietly with its perimeter lights. Some things belong only to the moment they happened, and the people who were there.